name is Carol Jones, and I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of Delaware. Tonight's discussion is the 19th Amendment, finally. It's part of our series on the U.S. Constitution titled We're the We in We the People. I'll be interviewing Mary Boyd, who is an attorney with a background in and a passion for constitutional law. And the program is on the amendment to the Constitution, just to remind you, that gave women the right to vote. We're coming up to two big anniversaries that involve this amendment. In 2020, we will celebrate the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the League of Women Voters, and also the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. Our conversation tonight will try to shed some light on how this amendment came about and the League's involvement. We'll also dip into Delaware's role in this process. We're pleased to be here in this lovely venue, the Lewis Library in Lewis, Delaware, and we're here in the Stacks. We're surrounded by books, and since this is an educational program, it's very appropriate. So, before we begin, we need to give a few credits. We thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for their generous support of this initiative, and Pulitzer Prizes for their partnership. We also thank the Delaware Humanities for their support and help in implementing this program. And I'm pleased to say we have the Executive Director of the Delaware Humanities with us tonight, Michelle Anstein. Would you please take a bow, Michelle, for the humanities. So Mary, let's start with a brief overview of how we came to our form of government, which is a constitutional republic, a form of democracy based on representational government.
It is. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, delighted to see all of you. This is my favorite topic of all topics, the Constitution itself. And of course, this is a wonderful year to celebrate the 19th Amendment and the right of women to vote. You know, it's a very interesting story. Many people would think it's a battle of the sexes. I don't know if any of you all saw this movie, War of the Roses, did you, with Kathleen Turner and Michael Douglas? It was a great movie. Well, the battle for the 19th Amendment was also called the War of the Roses. And if you wore a white rose, you were for the vote for women. And if you wore a red rose, you were opposed. But we're a long way from the 19th Amendment. Let's start from the beginning. This is an era I particularly like. People were living in America when it was discovered. You understand that? People often ask me, well, how do you discover an entity that is inhabited? And it was really under the international law of discovery. And this was, of course, a European invention. We wouldn't even have founded the New World without the invention of the compass, which is not a Western invention, it's an Eastern invention. The Europeans, once they figured out they could explore the world and get home safely, they began to explore the world. And this is what we all do in all eras. Whenever new inventions come, people rush to use them. So our founding is very interesting. 1607, as you all know from your studies, Jamestown. And the people that came to Jamestown were usually the second, third, and fourth sons of someone in England, because remember, the first son inherited everything. So people wanted to find riches, and they thought the New World would certainly be the place to go. So they came over. They were not well prepared. There was a great starving time in Jamestown. And of course, they could have been eliminated immediately by the native tribes. But they all got along, and believe it or not, the the people who lived here were not all that unhappy. It wasn't always a bad deal for them. They loved the stuff that the Europeans brought with them. They brought a lot of cooking utensils they'd never seen, and just different items of living that they loved. So Jamestown was a little bit different than Plymouth Plantation. And this is William Bradford. Remember your history. This is the Mayflower. This is the separatists coming from Holland to start a utopian community of Christian living. So this was the first utopia in America. What they brought with them were chests of drawers and bedding and artifacts, memories from home, and none of that did them any good, of course, when they landed in November in Massachusetts. So they had a very, very rough time. So I want you to imagine America just sort of hiding along the Atlantic seaboard, trying to survive. That's really our founding, trying to survive. They had to figure out what would work, what could be planted, how they were going to eat, and most of them died. So that's really the discovery, if you can call it that, of an inhabited land. What really, well, these colonies were either royal colonies, the king's colony, or they were proprietary colonies, privately owned. Some of them had charters. But our constitutional republic really began with the assemblies that those that survived put together to govern themselves. Remember on the Mayflower Compact was the first true governing document in America. Everybody agreed to obey. And so they formed little groups to govern themselves if they survived, each colony. That's the foundations of our constitutional republic, because we're used to self-government, to local government, to government from the bottom up. That's our tradition. Of course, then what happened quickly is the 7-Year War in Europe, you remember from your history, which was the French and Indian War in America, 1754, 1763. And all of a sudden, because the British won, we inherited land to the Mississippi River. So from these little colonies just trying to survive, all of a sudden you have a landmass to the Mississippi River. Well, people wanted that land, and they moved west. And the British, who had won the French and Indian War, decided that it was a very expensive war for them, and so they needed to tax the beneficiaries of that war, which were Americans. And when they put the taxes on, that, in a very simple way, caused a lot of... Taxes caused heated rhetoric in any period, but it was especially heated then. So after the Revolution, and we were lucky to win that, very lucky. If it weren't for a fog in New York Harbor, we would not be a nation today. So it's a fog, that's it. And of course, we had a wonderful leader in George Washington, but it was very lucky. So we governed ourselves at first in what you would recognize today as the United Nations. Each state had one vote. It was called the Articles of Confederation. It was a confederation, and no one had a greater import than anyone else. One vote. And everything had to be unanimous. There was no president. There was only a Congress. Well, Europe was looking at America with all this land and going, I don't think they can defend themselves. this might be easy. So George Washington decided that we had better strengthen our national presence in order to keep Europe from eyeing America. And they got together in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. It's one of those times in history when you have an assembly of great people all at once. They weren't all great, and they weren't all educated, and they weren't all brilliant, but together it was a brilliant body. Absolutely brilliant. So those 4 months produced this Constitution, and I think you have them up front and can
We do.
It's a very short document. And it was revolutionary in its time, and it still actually is revolutionary today. It's a revolutionary document, and it has not changed. It's basically 6 articles. The 7th is how to ratify, and then we have a mission statement at the beginning about we the people and what our values are. And what we value in our mission statement, among all things, is liberty, personal liberty for ourselves and our posterity. So that means that our constitutional republic main value is your ability to have personal liberty in your life. And it's a document that sets rules. So if you play football, you know what the length of the field is going to be, and you have these lines, and you have to get the ball 10 yards, make a first down. Well, that's what this is. This is the dimensions of the field and the rules. So it's not hard. It's only hard if you don't want to follow the rule. If you would like to maybe make it 9 yards. But they're not hard. And
Well, that sort of leads us, Mary, to my next question about changing the 10 yards to 9 yards. Originally, the Constitution was presented for ratification without amendments. That's
Without
how you
amendment.
change from 10 to 9, right?
you can't.
Basically, the amendment. But notably, without the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, and these very important amendments were passed in 1791, only 4 years after the Constitutional Convention. Why was that?
I started tonight talking about 1607, and now we're up to 1787. That's a long period of time. And in all that time, Americans are used to their liberty. They are used to their liberty. So they took a look at a group of fellows that sequestered themselves into Philadelphia in the hot summer, closed all the windows, would allow no reporters or no notes, no nothing. They vowed never to even talk about what went on in there. And they wore the wool suits, and they developed a system of government. And they tried to present it to a public who'd been, since 1607, completely free of people telling them what to do. So they were not happy. They wanted to make sure that however you structure the national government, we have individual rights against you that we want protected. And that's the key to the Bill of Rights. They're individual rights for you as an individual against a government. They are not rights for you against a private sector employer or any private person, only against the government. So they very adamantly said, if you don't develop a Bill of Rights, this Constitution will not be ratified. And James Madison said, we don't need a Bill of Rights. This Constitution provides all the rights you need because we value liberty. Therefore, We will maintain liberty. You can trust me. And they said, no, we don't trust you. So Madison changed his mind, developed the first 12 amendments, 10 of which were adopted, and because he promised it, the Constitution was ratified without them.
And they got it done then 4 years later, right? The amendments.
The amendments.
They got the Constitution ratified.
They promised the amendments, and the ratifying conventions believed their promise, and they delivered.
And they delivered.
And they delivered. So we have, the Bill of Rights are sacred to America, and they're unique in the world. We have protections as individuals against any government actor completely unique to America. And the way you amend the Constitution, which is what we're here for tonight, the 19th Amendment, is in Article 5. And I just want to briefly tell you what these articles are. There's only 6 of them. Article 1 is about Congress. At the convention in 1787, they spent half the summer just talking about Congress. They loved talking about Congress, and they feel like Congress is the jewel in our crown. They went home on vacation for July 4th. When I say went home, these are long treks to their places of living. So they took several weeks off. And they left a little committee and said, well, you better deal with the presidency. We've done Congress, that's our jewel in the crown, so we're going to be going, and you stay and you work on the presidency. And they left it to a New Jersey man named David Brearley. So he got a couple of people willing not to go home, and they worked out Article 2, which is the powers of the presidency of the United States. And before they left in September, they cobbled together Article 3, which is on the judiciary, basically creating a Supreme Court. Article 4 is about the relationship between the states. So Delaware has to honor Maryland's laws and public records, and all states have to honor each other's records. No state could have a private navy, and this was a very bad piece of news for Rhode Island, who loved its own little navy. They ran the smuggling rings right and left in Rhode Island, and they had all kinds of ships. Anyway, that's Article 4. Article 5 is how we amend, and on the last day, Constitution Day is September 17th. On the last day, they decided to fix an amendment process for the Constitution. So it either starts in Congress, 2/3 of each house, and then it's ratified by 3/4 of all the state legislatures, or it can actually start without Congress at all. We could start today a constitutional convention and leave out all these warring parties. We could leave out the House, we can leave out the Senate, and we can leave out the President. So they can be battling on. And in this wonderful document, they created a way for the citizens, in case they had a corrupt Congress and a corrupt president, they could do it themselves through their state legislatures. And then they could hold a constitutional convention and amend the Constitution, and Congress has nothing to do with it, and the president has nothing to do with it. Interesting. Very genius. It's never been done that way. It's only been done by Congress beginning the process, as is true in the 19th Amendment.
Yeah. Of course, we have to remember that this applied, this wonderful voting privilege in the Constitution applied primarily to male white property owners. Which brings us to the 19th Amendment in a kind of roundabout way. and which of course happened many years later. But just so that we're all on the same page, we're just sort of making a gigantic leap here from the early part of the, or from the late part of the 19th century to the 18th century to the early part of the 19th century. And then beyond into the 20th century, which is when the 19th Amendment was passed. Which is kind of interesting because as you reminded me during our discussions before this, one of the major things that happened with this amendment was that it immediately doubled the number of people who were eligible to vote. Now think about it. It doesn't make any difference what your population is to begin with. If you double something, it's substantial in the way that it affects your people, your environment. So anyway, the 19th Amendment reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." It's one of the shortest amendments. So, it may have begun, this movement for women's rights. There was anguish over the fact that women had no say in these things. And you could argue that Abigail Adams started the whole thing when she admonished her husband, John, during the time of the Constitutional Convention, "Don't forget the ladies, John." But perhaps we can agree that serious efforts to give women the right to vote began at the Seneca Falls meeting in 1848 with that group's Declaration of Sentiments. So how did we get to the 19th Amendment?
Well, we just got to 10 a few minutes ago. So I'll real quickly, because this is very important. The 11th, most of the amendments to the Constitution are what I would call technical. They correct things. The 11th and 12th Amendments just correct small errors in the Constitution. But the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are significant to our country. Those are not just technical changes. Those are real changes in our society. The 13th, these are the Civil War amendments, ending slavery, and not just for the government, but for any person. The 14th Amendment, which mandated that states grant all people, and not just citizens, and this is coming up today, really coming up today in legal circles. It grants to anyone in the jurisdiction of a state equal protection of the laws and due process of law. So the 14th Amendment is one of the most significant changes in our society. The 15th Amendment granted voting rights to black males. And this caused a tremendous controversy with the women in the suffragist movement. They felt like the 15th Amendment was incorrectly structured. It should have included women. There was great controversy on it. So it's not true. We have 27 amendments, but most of them are what I would call technical. There's only a handful that have changed our society forever. The Civil War amendments certainly have. And that leads us, slowly but surely, to the Progressive Amendments. And we're talking about the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Just think about what America had been through. We started as an agrarian society. We exported agrarian products. We were sort of, farmers. By the time we got into the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution in Britain had revolutionized the world. Steam power had revolutionized the world. And that came to America. And our economy grew. We were moving west like mad. We're acquiring territory, Louisiana Purchase, and then the Mexican War and new territory in the West. So people are moving, they're developing businesses, they're beginning to migrate to urban areas. We're not an agrarian society anymore. We're a product of the Industrial Revolution. The excesses of the Industrial Revolution, the social excesses, became the object of the Progressive Era and the Progressive Era amendments to the United States Constitution. So when we think of the 19th Amendment and the vote for women, I want to put it in a grouping of two other issues where it belongs. It shouldn't stand alone. It belongs in the grouping of the women who were abolitionists and virulent abolitionists. This movement is one of the most important social movements in America. And women played a huge role. Quaker women, I cannot say enough about in that role. So women were practicing in this controversy over slavery in our society, how to be powerful, how to be effective, and they were very effective. The 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment, plus a horrendous war. Their power grew, and as their power grew and people moved west, another problem arose that I want to put in the cocoon of this discussion, and that's the Women's Christian Temperance Society. That was a huge movement. Why? Because the whole movement west was lawless. I mean, there was a sheriff here and there, and there was a lot of liquor flowing, and very few women and a lot of liquor. This is one of the reasons that the West gave women the vote first. There were so few women and there was so much liquor that they wanted to throw a little gift to the women and hope they would come west. That's why the first state is Wyoming in 1869, right after the Civil War. And all the western states gave women the vote for that reason. Not because they thought it was theologically or ideologically the right thing to do. They wanted to attract females to the West. So this temperance movement is no joke. This was big, and most of the abolitionists were in that movement as well. So we had three movements coming together that empowered women: abolition, temperance, and suffragist. Together, it was more than, it produced, in the Progressive Era, which is 1890 to 1920, it produced two of those amendments. There were 4 progressive amendments. 2 of them were from that powerful group of women. Prohibition, which of course was repealed, to great celebration all over America, I can tell you, and the women's right to vote. But I don't want to just have the 19th Amendment as an exclusive. The 2 others, the 16th and 17th, dramatically changed our country. The federal government got its money. Federal government likes to have money. And it originally got its money by selling all this land. It owned all the land. So from the East Coast completely to California was owned by the federal government. And it sold land, and that's how it made its income. And then, according to the Constitution, it assessed each state, and each state paid its share of taxes based on its population. So the 16th Amendment says We're not going to do that anymore. We're going to go directly to an individual citizen and tax that citizen's income, which is what we have today. The 17th Amendment changed how we elect senators. And I'll very briefly just say this. The founders were not in favor of direct voting. Absolutely not. They had 3 ways to vote, and it's for a reason. They only allowed direct voting of House of Representative members every 2 years. In case you got a really incompetent one, they only serve 2 years and they're gone. The Senate was supposed to represent the state. So our senators from Delaware were primarily to represent the interests of Delaware. What are our industries? What are our agricultural needs? Our social needs? They were not supposed to represent the nation. So they were elected by the state legislatures for that reason. So they would stay loyal to the interests of each state. This is the concept of federalism, which is the basis of our Constitution. A small federal government and then very powerful state governments. So by directly electing the senators, their focus changed to the nation and not the state, and that has changed us. I'm not saying for good or ill, I'm just saying it's a big change. And then the 18th Amendment was prohibition, and we ended that. And some of you are smiling and some of you are not, so I'm not quite sure how you feel about prohibition. And then the 19th Amendment. And the 19th Amendment is almost inevitable. When you have women, beginning in 1830, with Sojourner Truth and some others, fighting for women's rights, fighting for abolition, fighting for temperance, trying to keep the family together. They felt liquor was a real detriment to the family unit. It led men astray. And in their thinking. So this movement for women to vote, this started way back in the 1830s. And as these 3 movements came together with the same people, it was very, very, very powerful. And they had some problems along the way, which I think we will discuss. But it was an inevitable movement.
And the women's, just to concentrate now on the women's right to vote, we've done a pretty good job on the background, I think. How did the suffragette movement get started, actually, and how did it influence the passage of the 19th Amendment? Before you answer, just let me explain briefly that those advocating for women's right to vote in this country are called suffragists. In England, they were referred to as suffragettes. And that's just a point of information. I'm not going to go into the reasons why. If you want the backstory, go to Wikipedia. But just so that we make the distinction, when we speak of suffragists, that is the movement that the women were involved with, who helped to establish the 19th Amendment, largely responsible for it.
Suffragists, yes. And they came to fruition with the women's vote at a time when our thinking in society changed into the progressive thinking. We thought, with the advances of science, that we could create a citizen and a family and a human being. We could make that happen scientifically. So a lot of the progressive era is about changing from a reliance on our theological background, which is very extensive in America and still extensive today, into a scientific. We can make people better. And we can make people better through science, and we can make people better through legislation that backs science. And so these women sort of followed that power, and they were very, very, very adamant that they do two things: that they be able to make these decisions legislatively through voting. In other words, through voting for the representative who's going to write the legislation that they think can change the world. That's why they wanted to vote, because that legislation was new and invigorating, and it was the McClure magazine. You know, it was Upton Sinclair writing about the meatpacking industry, and it was all of this social. Women wanted to be a part of it. They wanted to elect the people who were going to write those laws. So they came in that wave. And but it really started with the abolitionist movement. It started there, not with women's vote. And of course, the whole movement, women's movement, is considered to have started in New York in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. But soon they founded an organization, the National Association of Women's Suffrage, and soon ran into the usual pitfalls. That group opposed the 15th Amendment that allowed black males to vote because they thought it diluted the women's movement. So another association was formed of women who favored the passage of the 15th Amendment and the black vote. It went back and forth and back and forth. And the part of the story, which is sad, because it's a great story, is these women were so powerful, they learned what community organizing was. They organized from the bottom up. They organized at home. They organized locally. They had their little group meetings. They had, in Lewis, they would have a meeting. They would march in Lewis. They would do this and that, all local, county, state, rather than nationally. So this raised the question of racism. Can we include black women in our movement when racism was still what we call de jure by law in many areas of the country? And the answer was, by the white suffragists, the answer was no, you may not be included. So there's an element to the whole suffragist movement that has a racial component that was a fact of life. In fact, the suffragist movement, the 19th Amendment, is considered a sort of an upper middle class white movement. I don't think that's fair. It was a temperance movement and an abolitionist movement and a voting movement. And it is true that there were many associations started by other women to oppose it, and there certainly was a racial component. There was a big march in Washington, D.C. in 1913, like a march on Washington. Only the black suffragists were not allowed to march. This got fixed, of course, and all was well, but the whole racial component to our 19th Amendment has to really be told. It's also true that about this time in the early 20th century, there were so many powerful black women in the early part of the 20th century. To me, this is the golden age for these women. These black sororities, Alpha Kappa Alpha, and all of the black women's clubs, the Federation of Black Women's Clubs, the National Association for colored women. All of these women that founded these organizations were the most powerful women, honestly, America has ever known. They were outstanding. So, unfortunately, what's lost is a discussion of how they weren't included as they should have been. But here's the wonderful thing about these women. These women didn't stop because they weren't included. They didn't even get, they had fought slavery until we won. So this was just, okay, all right, we'll move on. I mean, they were just powerful. They never gave it a second thought. Yeah. These are great Americans.
Well, I want to pick up on that a little bit and explore that a little bit more in not in this next question, but in another one down the line. Because we are, after all, here in Delaware, and Delaware had an opportunity to be the state that was the deciding vote in the ratification of the 19th Amendment, and we blew it. So can you give us sort of a brief rundown of what happened in the state of Delaware?
Well, a brief rundown is about all it deserves, actually. I love it, though, that in the fight, Delaware was considered progressive, so it was considered a possibility of being the one to take this 19th Amendment over the top. But it petered out. However, I would say the most outstanding thing that happened was these women in Delaware who were suffragists kidnapped the Speaker of the House of the Delaware Assembly and locked him in a tavern. Now, I don't know if he was locked up with the liquor or whether he was put in a basement, but to keep him from voting or calling a vote, they kidnapped him and locked him up. And I think that's a wonderful story. However, Delaware was not the state. The state was Tennessee. And there was a representative whose vote that was needed, and he was opposed to women voting. I'm going to tell you why everyone was opposed to women voting in a second, but I want to tell you about Mr. Burns. He was the one that put it over the top in Tennessee, and he was opposed to women voting. His mother called him, wrote him a letter. You vote for it. And so he did. You know, it's a myth to think that men were opposed and women were for it. That is not true. Most of the people opposed to women voting were other women. They founded all kinds of organizations, and they wore their red roses. And if you were a male in this scene, the safest thing for you to do is to say nothing, right? Whichever way your wife, whatever view she supports, what are you going to do? How are you going to go home? So they tried to stay out of it. Honestly, it's a battle between women. It's not a battle of the sexes. And why were women opposed to it? Some of it, you know, we laugh about, but some of it's relatively benign, and some is sort of funny. Women were considered to have smaller brains, and therefore wouldn't be able to handle all the technical details of legislation. So we can throw that one away, I think. There was also the issue of double voting. You know, your husband's going to come home and tell you how to vote. So what good does that do? So we just have two votes the same way. So that was one of the reasons. The other was, there were more than one, but the primacy of the family, the primacy of being at home, taking care of the children. Think of the times. There were not the modern ways in which you care for your home then. It was a lot of work. And you stay home and take care of the kids and leave the nasty, dirty politics to the men. The other thing that we have to mention is the Bible. There are passages in the Bible, and I would direct you to Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 through 31. And there are other places in the Bible where the relationship between husband and wife is mentioned. But if you're in Bible study, you might want to go to Ephesians chapter 5. So there was great opposition in some people because it was clear to them that the Bible had mandated that women should submit to their husbands. And they were the head of the house and the moral heads of their families. We don't consider that too much today, but that was very important then. And one of the big reasons for the opposition. There were some male associations, but honestly, this was truly a battle between women.
I think we'll move on to this other question that I have, which I think is of real importance, but just a word. In terms of Delaware, Sussex County, believe it or not, was very much pro women's vote. Sussex County, this little corner of the world, who would have thought? But there weren't enough of them eventually to sustain it. And as Mary said, it finally just petered out. But we don't have time to go into it tonight, but there is some interesting reading, especially in newspaper articles, that you can find by going online about the Delaware women and men who were for the suffrage movement and what they did to move it along. Now, I wanted to go, we know that, you've alluded some to the fact that there were problems within the effort of getting women the vote. It wasn't all cooperation and inclusion, and there was a strong racial component, so let's discuss that problem, warts and all. Let's get it out into the open. Do you have more to add to some of the comments you made a little earlier about that?
I think I've gone over it. I think that we were lucky as a nation to have a group of women in the 19th century who made such a difference in our lives today. So rather than talk about the racial ugliness that did occur, I want to talk a little bit about these women. We hear about Susan B. Anthony was made into a coin in 1979, into $1, correct? Remember how you put it into the parking meter, and it never worked? Nobody could figure it out, so they withdrew it. Susan B. Anthony was a Quaker. She was a very powerful woman. No nonsense. Big in the abolitionist movement. She was the brawn. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the brains. She was a great writer. And together, they were absolutely a powerhouse. But there were other women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was from New York. Her father was a lawyer, so she came from a very well-to-do family. Here are the women I want you to remember from this discussion about the 19th Amendment. Not just Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Sojourner Truth. She's from New York. She spoke Dutch because New York was of course, colonized by the Dutch. In fact, the Mayflower could have been Dutch. They tried to get William Bradford. They wanted to fund it. We would have been Dutch. Well, we sort of are here in Lewis. Sojourner Truth lived about the time Washington was born, about the time George Washington died. She escaped slavery, and she was one of the founders of the women's rights movement in America. Sojourner Truth. Harriet Tubman, you may be familiar with, from Dorchester County, Maryland. That would be Cambridge, Maryland. She also escaped slavery, formed the Underground Railroad, saved around 700 or 900 people, never lost a person, never got caught. They all survived. And what's interesting, she actually led a division of Civil War soldiers in combat. The first woman ever to lead men in combat. This is Harriet Tubman. Not only that, in 1859, she bought property in New York where she retired. She bought property in her own name. Brought her parents, took care of them, and retired to New York before she died. Amazing woman. One of the great leaders of the women's rights movement in America, Harriet Tubman. Mary Church Terrell. She's very famous. She was a founder of NAACP, but she was a college graduate. She taught Latin. For those of you who took Latin in school, she taught Latin at Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. Very, very, very famous leader in the women's movement. These are all I cannot describe these women to you, how powerful they were in our culture and in our country. Ida B. Wells, she was a slave in Mississippi. Not a good place to be a slave in Mississippi. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freed her as a child. And she became an investigatory journalist. She started her own newspaper. Remember, this was the era of investigating and journalism and newspapers all over, so she was also very powerful. And lastly, I don't want you to forget these women. In fact, to me, when we talk about the women's movement, in my mind, these are the women I go to. I go to these women. Mary McLeod Bethune. She was the 15th of 17 children. Her parents were slaves. She was born in a little log cabin out in South Carolina. If you can just imagine this. She was injured as a child by the owner of his slaves. And she had a brain injury all of her life, although you would never know it. She could not read. No one in her family could read. And one day she was being taken around as part of the service to the house of the master. She went into the children's nursery and she picked up a book. And the child living there said, "You can't have that book because you can't read." She not only learned to read, she not only taught her whole family to read, she became the president of a university. These women are beyond description in terms of their gifts to our country. And they're overlooked. We don't study them. But they were absolutely part of what allowed the 19th Amendment to pass. Because finally, when you do this many grassroots movements, we had two things going. We had these powerful women, that you can tell I admire greatly. But then we had women who kept index cards of all the Congress people and all their habits. So if Senator so-and-so had a girlfriend, it was on an index card. They knew every detail about every one of those Congress people. So when it came time to the vote, out comes the index cards.
The first form of advocacy for the American woman, right? It's called blackmail.
The index cards turned out to be more effective than the lectures on the wonderfulness of women. So that's the story. It's a wonderful story.
Just bring us home then, and let's summarize, if you will, the impact, the overall impact of the ratification of this amendment. Not necessarily as a standalone, but its place in the way that this country has moved over the last 100 years.
Well, I would be giving you opinion now, not the story, not the facts. And I probably have a different opinion of it than many who study this issue. To me, it honors the founders. One of the reasons I love the story of the 19th Amendment is that it honors the founders. The founders wanted amendments to the Constitution to be very difficult. They did not want change to occur so dramatically and so profoundly over such a short period of time that people couldn't adjust. They couldn't adjust their lives. The other thing they wanted everything local. They wanted the power from the people, we the people of the United States, to come up from the bottom. So here comes Miss Mississippi, Ida B. Wells. Here comes all these women from Sussex County. That's what the founders had in mind. And what that preserves for us, and what the 19th Amendment demonstrates to us, it protects the liberty that is the primary value of the Constitution of the United States.
And that's a lot. Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much. That's all the time we have. So on behalf of the League of Women Voters, many thanks to Mary Boyd for sharing her expertise with us. And thanks to all, including the many League members who were involved in setting this up and getting it done tonight. Members of the Sussex County, Delaware League of Women Voters are pretty special, I mean to tell you. And we thank again the Delaware Humanities for helping us with this project. And we thank you, members of the audience, because I think you lent an energy to this interview tonight that wouldn't necessarily have been here if you had not been here. That's true. Our goal was to provide you with a better understanding of the passage of the 19th Amendment and its impact on our country. And we hope we achieved it. So let us know with your evaluation sheets. Thanks again, everybody.